Somebody is going to kill me for this, but let's take a moment to talk about the most problematic damage type in Elden Ring. Yes, let's discuss holy damage, whether or not it's actually bad. And by the way, the answer to that is yes, but no, it's complicated. Now give me a moment to explain. While Elden Ring does have 8 different damage types, Faith is the apex of these choices, with access to every single type through incantations, but it does mostly focus on 2, Fire and Holy. And while Fire is a staple that remains quite powerful, Holy remains controversial, and for a good reason. Let's put it in a nice way, its viability is very niche. Some will argue that it's garbage, and alone against a lot of bosses, yes, it kind of is as a raw damage type. If you're just looking at pure numbers and on paper, most lesser enemies are not resistant to it, so it can be quite monstrous, but the raw damage of holy weapons can be incredibly insane. In PvP, it has no disadvantage. In fact, in PvP, it's only second to lightning and piercing damage in terms of the best damage type. Now, PvE, it is in general just a bad damage type, except it really isn't, at least when you look at the overall picture. In fact, there's some incredibly great PvE options. To argue that something like the Envoy's Longhorn, Golden Lance, Cerulous Tree, the Halo Scythe, or Dorvis's Blade, as well as the Sacred Relic Sword as bad PvE options is hilarious. These things are absolutely monstrous. There are only 2 bosses that kind of ruin this, but we'll get to those later. But what makes this frustrating is that what really makes this good is the focus on skills. Like, in general, like when you look at actually hitting with the holy damage of the weapon itself, it is quite pathetic against these enemies because they're all incredibly resistant to it. It is the raw damage of these skills that really push across. And when you compare this to fire damage, which is automatically better when you're using it as an infusion, just because less things are resistant to it, yeah, you're really rarely gonna ever use holy as a PvE infusion when you're fighting bosses. Unfortunately, Sacred Infusion is only great when you're using the skills, and there are only 2 good damaging Sacred Ashes of War. Golden Lance is the only one that's actually competent when fighting bosses, while Sacred Blade, yes, it is a range option, but it's much better just to use it for the skill damage itself and only against undead enemies. Yes, it's great in PvP, but that's a different story entirely. So at least when you're looking at the raw attacks, usually Flame is always going to be better than Sacred. So why would you really build it? Like, you see people going out with bandit flaming swords all the time, but you don't see people going out with bandit sacred swords for a reason. It's because fire is just incredible. Everyone uses it. And of course, it becomes part of your main build. One of the best incantations are also fire damage. So when you're already multiplying it, you got flame granting strength. Why are you going to go holy damage? There's very few ways to buff the holy damage on yourself outside of Golden Vow, and that buffs fire as well. Flame granting strength, easy buff, no downside. Meanwhile, in order to buff holy, you're going to use what? House Brewery, which is going to make you take more damage. Yes, it's good, but it's not phenomenal. But regardless of all of that, the skills I mentioned from all those previous weapons, the Envoy's Longhorn, Golden Lance, Charlotte's Spear, Halo Scythe, everything else, those actually do kind of make it worth it, because they can be incredible, especially in PvE, and yes, in PvP as well, I guess, because there's not that same weakness in PvP that Holy has within the base game. Yes, it still typically does split damage, but it still does a phenomenal job. And this is also not to diss on the unique weapons. The unique weapons, such as America's Hammer, the Halo Scythe, the Sacred Relic Sword, or any of the Crucible Knight weapons, their regular attacks are good, but that is not because of holy damage, but that's because of regular attacks scale off of dexterity and strength more than they do off of faith. Now, getting back to the skills, to argue the holy skills themselves are bad is a whole world of ignorance. It doesn't really matter the fact that they typically do half damage, because these skills are absolutely brutal. In fact, the damage they dish out is insane. Like, it is almost a trope that YouTubers or other creators all the time would run a holy weapon and be shocked at how much they can trivialize the game. And honestly, I'm not too surprised by this, because they look at the numbers, they're like, oh, okay, so it does half damage, it sucks. And yes, typically it does if you're hitting with the weapon itself, but when you actually run these weapons against most bosses, there are going to be 2 exceptions. Yeah, the damage they pop out is just ridiculous. Like, why is it this high? I'm joking, it's quite reasonable for them to be this high, but for people to keep on dissing these weapons or just overlooking them is absolutely insane when they're just amazing. These are by far the most underrated weapons in the game, to the point where I really cannot even discuss an underrated weapons video because I feel like I'm just going to have to cover only holy weapons because they're just great. Are they objectively the best? No, because there's other great weapons out there, and there's a huge variety of weapons in Elden Ring. But at the same time, some of these are the best. Like Envoy's Longhorn is just a cheese machine. So when people keep on disregarding holy weapons just because they do holy damage, it does kind of result in a lot of problems of people never trying them out, and that leads to a bunch of underrated weapons. Wow, it's mostly holy weapons, and yes, creators now finally look at them and be like, oh wow, this is amazing. It's always been amazing, it's always been here. You just overlook it because you see the holy damage and automatically assume it's bad. So yes, the best way to put it is holy skills are good, not because they're holy damage, but just the raw damage they pump out. And there are some skills that pump out a combination of holy damage and physical damage, like the Crucible Knight weapons. And honestly, I would still say those kind of make holy damage look good, but of course it's more of a hybrid, so you gotta give Strain some credit here. Now for the rest of the Sacred Ashes of War, or even just all of them in general, I typically use them more on keen, heavy, and lightning builds. And oftentimes that's just because of the fact that those are going to be better damage types. Piercing, thrusting, slashing, and lightning damage are just incredibly great, and they all outperform holy, at least in PvE. Now the spells and incants are a completely different can of worms, just because it requires a high stat investment and intelligence, making it so it's almost like a complete wall, preventing you from going to the strength or the dexterity options. So you have one where you get some good skills, and these good skills can give you access to also different weapon types and a plethora of different damage types they could also use for more and more different types of weapons. Or you go for the Prince of Death Staff and the Golden Order Seal and just go straight into spell casting and be a squishy caster. Now it does prevent you from going one way or the other, unfortunately, but it is still an option. I wouldn't go this route for the sake of doing more holy damage. I would rather go this route for the sake of using the Prince of Death Staff or the Golden Order Seal because the scale is higher, but that's just me. Now let's talk about the one thing that is actually really bad about holy damage, the one quality that is almost completely irredeemable, and that is going to be one specific set of bosses, Radabeast and Malekith. I'm gonna have to go on a rant about this one. These are two mandatory bosses in the game. Yes, there are gonna be times in which you have plenty of enemies that are gonna be immune to fire damage. You're gonna have enemies that are gonna be high resistant to lightning damage. That happens. But 80% resistance mandatory boss that you have to fight. What were they thinking? Because players typically build around the concept of a theme. That's what people like doing. That's what cosplays are so popular. So why do they give an 80% resistance to a boss like that is mandatory for a damage type that's supposed to be one of the most powerful? But 80% resistance versus 40% resistance, you're doing 20% of the damage compared to 60%. You're doing a third of the amount of damage you would be doing if they had a 40% resistance. All the 40% from earlier is completely tolerable, and the fact is, it would be fine if it was one boss, if it was just Malekith, if it was just the Elden Beast or even Radabeast itself. That's totally fine. But it's two of them, and they're two of the three hardest bosses in the game. Yeah, it's gonna garner a lot of dislike for holy damage because, whoa, it becomes really hard to do a exclusively holy damage run in a game. I could run a complete lightning build and go through the entire game with very little problem. I could run a complete fire damage build, a whole piercing damage build, slash damage, match damage, yes, fire damage. There are gonna be some things completely immune, but I can avoid those things. But a mandatory boss with that resistance number kind of makes it seem like holy is just not worth it. And that is the biggest gripe I have with holy damage in the game. So would I consider holy damage a bad damage type? Yes, but is it really that bad? No. So if you want to think about the pros and cons, the pros is the skills are amazing to the point where overall, outside of the 8% resistance, its skills do a phenomenal amount of damage, and objectively the damage type is pretty solid in PvP. The cons are it is held back by having about a 40% resistance on most of the difficult bosses of the game, and the fact that 2 of the hardest bosses in the game, 2 of the 3, have an 80% resistance to holy damage. Not only that, since there's a lot of enemies with about 40% resistance, the regular basic attacks are just going to kind of fall behind and do much less damage. Well, thank you guys for getting this far in the video. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have an awesome day.